I'm Tom Ruller. I'm the New York State Archivist. This year, 2021, marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the New York State Archives. It's hard to believe that New York, one of the original 13 colonies, was one of the last states in the Union to formally establish a state archives. At the State Archives, we preserve and make available the official records of New York's colonial and state government. Today, we're going to talk a little bit with some of my predecessors, Ed Weldon, Larry Hackman, V. Chapman Smith, and Chris Ward, who will walk us through how this program that protects and preserves the critical records of state government, supports the protection and accessibility and management of local government records across the state, helps support the protection and availability of records in non-government repositories across the state, delivers educational resources to K-12 to help students across the state learn more about their communities, learn more about the country, learn more about themselves, and learn more about the people that made this state great. We had very humble beginnings in 1971. Today, the New York State Archives is one of the largest institutions of its kind in the country. We're proud of the work we do here. We're proud of all that's come before us. And we're excited about the next 50 years to help ensure that New York's historical record, that New York's active records, that New Yorkers benefit from the memory that their records provide. We are privileged to have the opportunity to talk to every single individual who has served as the New York State Archivist. And it's going to be an interesting conversation because all of them understand and appreciate the value of archives, the role of government records in protecting citizens' rights, and helping ensure the legacy of our republic continues on. And so I'm very privileged to have had the opportunity to meet all of these people over the course of my career. And I'm especially grateful for the chance to talk to all of them today. And I hope everyone that watches this program gets the same sense of excitement, commitment, and recognition of the value of what we do and why we do it. So with that, let me just do some quick introductions. Edward Weldon was the first New York State Archivist. He served from 1974 until 1980. Ed is a native of Florida. He's also served in leadership positions with the U.S. National Archives and was the director of the Georgia Department of Archives and History. Ed is a distinguished fellow of the Society of American Archivists, served as the editor of the American Archivist, the journal of the Society, and is a past president and board member of the Society. Ed currently lives in Calhoun, Georgia with his wife, Jane. Larry J. Hackman was the second New York State Archivist, serving from 1981 until 1995. A native of Missouri, Larry was the first director of the Records Grant Program of the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, the grant-making arm of the National Archives. Larry's held leadership positions at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and was the director of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri until 2000. Larry is a distinguished fellow of the Society of American Archivists, has chaired the program committee for the Society's annual meeting, and has served on its board. He's also served on the board of directors of many organizations, including the National Council of Public History, the Research Libraries Group, and the Rockefeller Archive Center. Larry currently lives in the Boston area. V. Chapman Smith, the third New York State Archivist, is now retired after over 30 years of executive leadership in organizational capacity building after working in the private and public sectors. She left New York State to serve as the National Archives Mid-Atlantic Regional Administrator in Philadelphia. While in Philadelphia, her work included the erection of the first public monument in Philadelphia at City Hall to honor an African-American 19th century civil rights leader, O.V. Cato, along with a year-long education initiative for the Philadelphia School District to study his legacy. In her retirement, V volunteers her time as a civil rights and social public historian. Among these, she serves as a project manager to preserve the historical assets of Eden Cemetery, a National Historic Site and the oldest continuously operating African-American cemetery company in the United States, as well as being on the board of the Eastern State Penitentiary Historical Site, a site dedicated to interpreting the legacy of American criminal justice reform. V currently lives in Philadelphia. Christine Ward was the fourth New York State Archivist. Chris worked for over 33 years at the New York State Archives, and after serving as acting state archivist for 2 years, was appointed Assistant Education Commissioner and State Archivist in 2003. Chris was also CEO of the New York State Archives Partnership Trust, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. During her career, Chris wrote and lectured extensively on management and leadership of cultural institutions, served on numerous professional and national committees, and served as a board member and officer of the Council of State Archivists. Chris remains active in the history and archives community and is currently serving on the boards of the New York State Archives Partnership Trust and the Hart Cluett Museum in Troy, New York. Welcome to all of you. And again, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your experiences. I'm excited about this conversation. Ed, can I start with you with a couple of quick questions for you? You and I have talked about how one specific document enabled you to get the budgetary resources necessary to hire staff and truly start the state archives in 1974. Again, just for everyone's sort of historical timeline, the law creating the state archives was passed in 1971, hence our 50th anniversary. But Ed came on board in 1974 and was tasked with creating the state archives and laying the foundation of the institution we have today. So you talk about one specific document that was a doorway for you to get the resources to start the state archives. I think it was the March 13th, 1656 letter from the directors of the Dutch West India Company to Peter Stuyvesant, directing him to allow a group of Jewish settlers who were in the Dutch colony in Brazil to relocate to New Netherlands. How did this document have such a profound impact and enable you to start the work that you were tasked with doing?
Well, it was an example of a document that people could relate to. And I think that's one of the issues that we take advantage of in our pursuits, that people do find identity in documentation. And you mentioned the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. When we started, they had to have a state board appointed by the governor. And this board was to develop a plan for addressing the needs of the state. And the governor's office had to appoint somebody, and that was Judah Gribbets. And Mr. Gribbets appointed a number of people. And especially effective in this was Eugene Bachman, who was a municipal archivist in New York City. And the budget that the education department requested was for $100,000, which is big money in those 70s. When it came back from the governor's budget office, it was cut in half. So Gene said, let's go see Judah, but bring him something from Jewish history. So I talked to a colleague, and he gave me the copy of this document and said, take that. So I went to New York to the governor's office and saw Judah with Gene, and they talked about their Jewish roots and the community and the heritage, and how important it was to them. And when the final governor's budget came out, they added back the $100,000, so we had $150,000. Well, this was a big help in the education department to convince some of the authorities there that we had some value. And of course, it trickles up to the regents, and they began to see that too. And it symbolizes the value to individuals of their own identity through a record, especially a government record, because it's important.
Well, I'll testify. In 2019, this New York State Archives had a booth at the New York State Fair, and we still have a stock of publications, the title of which is Researching the History of Your School. And we brought a stock of these publications with us. They flew off the shelves, and people said, oh my goodness, this is a great thing that I can bring to my school kids. Between teachers, parents, and even students loved it. Larry, can I turn to you for a minute or two?
How about 9, Tom? I came to Albany 40 years ago next month. And as I've thought back about that period in a different way maybe than Ed has been thinking, and that's how to kind of think about a framework for what I thought we were about in those years. And the word that I came up with, and it's one we're hearing all the time now, is infrastructure. And I'm hoping you'll agree that it's appropriate to consider 1981-95 as a time when much more of the basic infrastructure, I would call it hard infrastructure, of the state archives was brought into place, and most of it, with some modifications, continues to this day. To build a strong infrastructure, you need to go through a good design process. And that design process, in fact, was that statewide assessment and reporting project, which produced at the end something called Toward a Usable Past. And that report reflected really the first ever broad survey and analysis of archival conditions and needs in New York. Spread across the report were recommendations suggesting what the state archives should be, should do, and should be, and reflected certainly what I hoped it could be. We then drew extensively on those recommendations and strategies for action. That initial design stage, I think, also was indicative of the way we pursued the recommendations, the way we went about our work. It was extensive and consultative. It conveyed our high expectations for ourselves and others on a broad scale. It provided an attractive and well-organized report, which was widely distributed and vigorously promoted. It assumed extensive follow-up engagement with those whose interests were affected and those who could help bring about the changes we thought were needed. Working with others, we refined strategies and drafted and advanced proposals when the time was right. We initiated a quarterly newsletter, some of you may remember, For the Record, again distributed very widely to share plans and progress across that agenda and toward a usable past. So we broadened purposeful relationships with influential individuals and organizations, shaping networks and coalitions when it was possible. We also drew on advice, endorsement, and support from advisory and oversight bodies. Within 3 years of Toward a Usable Past, with more than a little help from our friends on each step forward, we began to have success in building important hard infrastructure. By that, I mean infrastructure designed to endure. The only hard infrastructure piece not anticipated in Toward a Usable Past was passage in 1992 of the legislation creating the State Archives Partnership Trust. The proposal to create the trust was the product of my frustration at being unable to find another strategy beyond those small incremental annual appropriations to attack that 350-year backlog created by New York's archival delinquency, if you will. I had hoped that the trust would be a kind of a breakout strategy whereby private and government funds each could lever further increases from the other source and wind up offering a significant intervention on that backlog. And that effort, as you've mentioned, continues. My nearly 14 years as state archivist were, to me, exciting, challenging, energizing, instructive, the most rewarding professional experience in my career. And I am deeply grateful for the opportunity. And so many of the memories and anecdotes confirm what you were saying earlier, the connection of the right document with the right person at the right time, and of course, with the right ask at the end of it.
And I will testify that that connection spans from the average person on the street to the governor. I'll share with you my little quick anecdote. Again, we were at the state fair in Syracuse. 1 million people go to the New York State Fair. We had our booth there. It was the first time that we knew that we had a booth. Man comes up to the booth. I happen to be there, and he says, "Archives, what's that? What do you people do?" Well, we preserve the historical records of the state. And he said, "Well, would you have any records of the Reform School out in Rochester? Would you have any records of that?" "Yeah, I know we would." "Well, my father allegedly was there, but my father died when I was young and we never knew anything about his life. Would you be able to tell me anything about this guy?" I connected the guy to our researcher unit here, the reference desk here in Albany. He called. 2 days later, this guy comes back to the booth and he said, "Listen, I called your archive and I spoke to an archivist and he gave me a copy of my father's whole story. And he told me the guy's life story, how he broke out. We never knew anything about my father. We never knew anything about his past. You have changed my life and the life of my sisters. He came back to that booth every day after that. We have a guy out in Western New York who will be one of the strongest supporters of archives. He's not pulling a lever of power here in Albany. He's not a head of a huge philanthropic foundation. But that one document that told him about his family changed his entire perspective and changed his life. V. Chapman Smith, how are you?
Just totally mesmerized by the stories that Ed and Larry have told. And in my head, I've been linking together what my tenure has meant to me and also what I benefited from coming in as state archivist. I've always felt that I was coming in and I had to fill some really big shoes. And I'm coming more from a records management perspective, even though I was trained in archives in graduate school. But my principal training was as a public historian. So I'm coming into this differently. And I know one of the things you had asked us to think about was what made you choose a career in archives. And I told you that I think archives chose me. I did not go into this thinking I was going to be an archivist. I actually started my graduate career really grounded in the history profession, but with a strong German language background. And my interest in documents actually came out of that German background. Germans are very document-driven people. And when I started studying archives, it was that German stuff that was really reinforcing the importance of documentation. And so I was driven by the need to make sure that archives were more inclusive and not just telling what I would call one layer of story. So I get to the New York State Archives and I see that there is an extraordinary infrastructure that has been put in place by Larry Hackman, which also had built off of Ed Weldon's earlier work. That infrastructure gave me the leverage to push forward with some other approaches that I thought could be helpful to bring friends and resources and attention to the state archives and also enable us to move forward in some of the ways that Larry had envisioned, particularly with the Archives Partnership Trust. We needed to make sure people saw us as a very comprehensive archive, not just there for the government records, but there also for the documentary heritage records of New York, because they're all linked together. And so my charge was to get people to see and care about the state archives in a more dynamic way. I love the story of the state fair because that's important. People need to see a personal connection to the records that are being preserved. And we had this extraordinary education program, and there were a couple of projects that were going to make it possible for us to leverage the records of the state archives, the records of local government, and the records that we have helped to save through the documentary heritage program to bring them together as resources that we could share, and also encourage communities and young people to use those records in ways that showcase their importance to New York State. And I love getting an army of young people willing to talk about us, because we would take teachers and young students on our legislative trips to advocate for the state archives and its programs. And not too many people could say no to a kid. You get a kid who's all excited, like, I come from this community and I did my class trip to the state archives, and then I went back in my community and I used these other resources that the state archives help to preserve. And look what I can give you as a gift. This is the story of us. That's what these kids would do. And so that was extremely helpful. It also enabled me as the head of the Archives Partnership Trust to make the case for, one, the trust board, and two, the value of what we were doing. And we were able to get a lot more money to do extensive programming, public facing programming. And we were able to get the magazine, New York State Archives, launched, which brings together the real picture of what New York is about in terms of archives. It also got people really interested on the state level in funding the infrastructure work that needed to be done in the building. That was a big lift to try to get that funding in place to not only have a space where the collections were properly cared for and stored, but also have a public space. I think from my perspective, the most important thing I took away from my experience as state archivist is that it actually shaped the rest of what I ended up doing. I came back to Philadelphia to be regional administrator for the National Archives. I knew that was going to be my last job, but it shaped how I needed to engage the National Archives operations with the citizens of the Mid-Atlantic. It could no longer just be a passive place, but it had to be a proactive place. And so we actually did a lot more public history, education, outreach in Philadelphia through the National Archives facility. And we became one of the strongest National Archives programs. And it was all built upon my experience at the New York State Archives. So the New York State Archives to me was not just what I contributed during my tenure, but also what it did in terms of shaping me for the remaining 18 years of my career, which I spent here in Philadelphia. And to this day, I do call the archivist in the state of Pennsylvania, and I tell him he needs to be doing more. He needs to be thinking about how the program in New York has been more dynamic in terms of reaching out to communities, because it's the under-recognized, underserved communities that are holding archives that really have important stories. And New York has done an extraordinary job of pulling those out, and they're reflected in the New York Archives magazine.
Chris Ward, your name has come up by every single one of us.
Well, I've been with the State Archives for a long time, and I feel as if I grew up in the State Archives. I certainly grew up professionally there, and I feel as if I came on the heels of some great visionaries and could see the results of the work that you did from the moment I came to the archives, and we all began building on that. Larry and V, I can't thank the two of you enough for being my mentors and ultimately to get me to a point where I could feel confident in being an acting state archivist and then eventually taking on that role. I feel as if I came in as a steward, and my challenge, and it was a great challenge, was to keep this organization alive and make it thrive and grow it more. And so I was able to come in and work with what was already there. And I can't thank you all enough for that. I hope that I was a good steward of this program that you built, and that where it was when I left it was in a stronger place, perhaps. And when I say stronger, I just mean stronger in terms of the organization itself, because we went through a lot of economic ups and downs during my tenure. And there were times when we were riding high, mostly at the beginning. And there was a time when the bottom fell out of everything in 2008. And we had to retrench and sort of rethink how to do what we had to do with a whole lot less. And what I was going to say today was about partners, because again, you've all talked a lot about relationships, the importance of building and keeping those relationships. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on some of those partners and what they kind of helped us to do over the 13 or so years that I was leading the organization. And I think I would like very much to acknowledge the most important partners of all were the staff. Their commitment, their determination, their loyalty and not to mention their expertise and their extreme creativity, especially when we had downturns in the economy. They were able, in general, to just turn on a dime, and they always produced. I can't say enough about them. I feel strongly that without the staff that we had, nothing would or could have been achieved. And we had strong support from the State Education Department and Office of Cultural Education Leadership and the various commissioners of education, and my hero, Carol Huxley, the Deputy Commissioner for Cultural Education, and also members of the Board of Regents. My goodness, they went to bat for us strongly, and we had incredible support from the legislature, particularly support for electronic records programs, for digitization, for facility improvement and expansion, and all the various renovations that occurred in the state archives over time. And I will say that we enjoyed bipartisan support in the legislature, which was absolutely wonderful. So again, one other really helpful professional contact that we used was through our participation in statewide and regional professional organizations, such as the Society of American Archivists and the Council of State Archivists. So we were able to work with our professional colleagues in other states who we worked a lot with on projects through COSA, where we really put our heads together and did a lot of problem solving on issues that all state archives were dealing with. Again, a lot of electronic records issues, digitization issues, disaster response, which became a huge issue during my tenure. And that had a lot to do with the fact that we had ice jams, we had flooding, and oftentimes these natural disasters necessitated quick and rapid response in order to save property, including records. So again, those partnerships were a two-way street. We helped a lot of our constituents do what they had to do, respond to disasters or respond to records issues, whatever. And they came back and helped us in many ways as well. So it was always a mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah, and listening to all of you, some of these big terms, infrastructure, partnerships, and relationships just resonate over and over and over again. Former Chancellor Emeritus Hayden still calls me with some research question because you all built a relationship. I just want to give you a little bit of data about your program because each of you has a brick in, I'll say, the sidewalk of the state archives or whatever we want to call it. The New York State Archives is the largest repository of state government records of any state archives in the United States. We have the largest collection because of the work that you have done. If you look at Toward a Usable Past and start to look at some of the recommendations, you'll see that many of those recommendations have been achieved and continue to show full flower. If you look at the Documentary Heritage Program, we have a statewide program that delivers quality service, training, and support to non-government repositories across the state and ensures that the records of every community, regardless of where that community is, are preserved, accessible, and have resources to help them do what they need to do. Because the state archives is present across this state because of the work that you did and the relationships that you made. We only have a couple of more minutes because I know you all have a whole lot going on. One of the questions that I want to know is if you had the opportunity to talk to every single New Yorker or any New Yorker or any person, what do you think every single person should know about the role of government records and government archives in their life? Larry, you meet somebody on the street. Okay, this is why you need to know that government archives are important.
Informed citizens think of archives as places where historians go, maybe genealogists go, maybe amateur historians go, but they don't understand what the really sacred role is of the state archives to ensure that records of enduring value to citizens and their organizations are not destroyed prematurely. They help make their government more accountable. They protect the rights and privileges of citizens and organizations under law. They provide the raw materials for evaluation of government policies and practices. That's the old list that pops into my head.
The New York State Archives is a great example of how a government archival institution can be the center for ensuring that the archives of our country are preserved, because we need all of them to tell the story of America. We won't know who we are unless we have as complete a record as possible. And it becomes the foundation for civic education. The government records gives us great insight into the decisions of the governmental people, the laws of our country or our state, but it's also those community records that help us understand how the citizens interacted with the government. Because as a civil rights and public historian, I have to put the two together to really get the full picture. And so one of the things I think is important is that New York has shown us as an institution that we need to make sure we're taking care of all of it, because our citizens need to know not only what government did, but how they responded to what government did. How is our democracy working for us as citizens of America?
I have a concept that just really came to me. It's a word that we see a lot today, and that's existential. It documents experience, existence, and your gentleman at the fair, his existence was affected by reestablishing this relationship with his father through the records. And every case that V has talked about, getting students to be involved in it, it's to show their existence.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you. I have to say that I am so proud of the opportunity that I have to build on the legacies that you all have made, and to be able to steward this organization, picking up from Chris, into the next century. The institution that you built does all those things that you talked about. It guarantees and demonstrates the existence. It gives people the opportunity to see who they are and where they came from. It's open to every community across the state so that every single person can see who they are, where they came from, and what they're about. It's here because it ensures that every single person in this state has the opportunity to interact with and watch their government in action and hold it accountable. And it's here because it supports the work of governments, of local governments, and of communities in doing the work that they need to do. We serve the people of this state, and we don't just serve the people of this state today. We serve the people of the past, and most importantly, we serve the future generations. We are stewarding what has happened to give it to the future. And none of that would be possible without the hard work, the dedication, and the unbelievably brilliant leadership that all of you provided. And so I'm grateful. I'm incredibly grateful for what you have given us, me as the archivist, but me as a citizen of this state. So thank you all very, very much.